Recording in progress.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Cardiac Rehabilitation Rounds. I'm Jennifer Reed, the Program Chair of Cardiac Rehabilitation here at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. Roughly 2 years ago, we launched this Cardiac Rehabilitation Round series with presentations every other month from September to May, focusing on international researchers to increase knowledge translation and strengthen collaborations in cardiovascular prevention and rehabilitation, both within and outside the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. I am thrilled this afternoon to welcome Dr. Ollie Jay to this hybrid event, and we are so appreciative of him willing to meet with us. He is from Sydney, but he's just landed in London, so the time change is a little easier on his schedule or sleep this afternoon, thankfully. I want to also share with the audience, those in person and many online, we have nearly 200 attendees registrations for the presentation this afternoon, and our registrations span from Australia, probably no surprise to Ollie, Belgium, Brazil, Ireland, Kenya, Slovenia, and South Korea this afternoon. For those in the room, any questions following the presentation must be posed using the standing microphone just up here. For those joining us virtually, submit your questions using the Q&A feature, not the chat as per usual. We will also be accepting live questions at the end. Use the hand up feature and you'll be asked to unmute by myself. If you're having any technical difficulties, please use the chat feature. Okay, without further ado, I get to introduce Dr. Jay. He is a professor of heat and health and the director of the Heat and Health Research Centre in the Faculty of Medicine and Health at the University of Sydney, Australia. He is an NHMRC, which is the National Health and Medical Research Council Investigator Fellow, and has led several large-scale projects that have directly influenced international public health heatwave policies in the United States, Europe, and Australia. And if you were listening to our banter just before the session began, I was sharing how I spent several weeks in France and I certainly could feel the heat wave last July. So this is certainly not the beginning. It's a continuation of these really important factors to evaluate. He has also led extreme heat policy development for both Sports Medicine Australia, Tennis Australia, Australian Open, and Cricket Australia, and was the lead head consultant for the Australian Olympic team in the Paris 2024 Games. He was recently profiled by The Lancet in their 2021 Heat and Health series, and his research program has been featured in Science and Nature, highlighting his lead global contributions to protecting societies most vulnerable to the heat. Since 2024, he has served as the chair of the Hazards and Impact Working Group for the Global Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change team. Wow. Well, we are very excited again, as I mentioned, to welcome you virtually. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to attend this talk today. So I'll move straight on to my opening slide, which hopefully is pretty familiar for everybody online and in person. This is a figure that's been shown many times that demonstrates the way in which average global temperatures have changed over the last 150 years. And it's all relative to a pre-industrial baseline of the mid 19th century. And so I like to use a few, first of all, the trajectory is very clear, but I like to use a few anchor points here just to provide a bit of context. So I'm almost 51 years old. I was born in 1975. And the level of warming that was experienced in the 125 years before I was born was around about 0.2 degrees Celsius, if you take into account the up and down that you see through the variability of a natural system. But I'm also a father, and my daughter Lottie was born in 2020. And in the 5 years since she was born, we've experienced as much warming in that period of time as we did in the 125 years before I was born. So I think that really emphasizes the level of warming that we're experiencing. Now, average global temperatures from the perspective of heat and health are not the primary concern. Of course, there are other reasons that we should be concerned about global warming. But from a perspective of heat and health, the issue is the extremes. So these are typically defined as heat waves. So this is some examples of some headlines in the world press that report the mortality rates that are associated with extreme heat events or just hot summers. So in the independent newspaper in the top left there, 47,000 deaths was associated with extreme heat exposure just in Europe alone in the summer of 2023. What we've learned in the last few years is through different epidemiological methodologies is that we can estimate the number of heat-related deaths annually worldwide. And so we just published the latest Lancet Countdown Global Report about 3 weeks ago. And when we have a heat and health, we have 5 heat and health indicators, and indicator 1.1.5, which is the indicator for heat-related mortality, reported that there were 546,000 deaths annually in the period between 2012 and 2021. So if we want a bit of context for that, then that's approximately 1 death every minute. Or if we want to be even more dramatic, that's the equivalent of a jumbo jet full of people crashing every 7 hours throughout the year. Now, if we look at this mortality statistic, it's worthwhile comparing it to slightly cooler times. So let's say the mid-1990s. So relative to the 1990s, this annual death rate has increased by about 60%. Now, of course, people often point out that the population has grown quite substantially since the mid-90s. However, even if we account for the growth in global population, this still represents a 23% increase in annual deaths due to extreme heat exposure. One thing that I really like to emphasize when giving these talks is that often we focus on mortality, which of course is the ultimate health impact of extreme heat. But this is really the tip, the very tip of a very large iceberg. These are the data that are above the surface that we can actually count within our health system. So we've got heat-related deaths, and then we've also got heat-related hospitalizations. Hospitalizations are really important to take into account. Often they're around about 10-fold greater than the death count, depending on the country that's under investigation. And also the cost is also quite substantial, of course, on the health system. But if we just divert our attention away from heat-related deaths and hospitalizations that are counted within our health system, we know that there are other vast heat-related impacts that impact human health and well-being in really profound ways that not necessarily result in it being counted by the health system, but are still very important to take care of indeed. So the way in which we think about this is the way in which extreme heat and hot weather impacts human health and well-being in a variety of different ways across the human lifespan. So there are very repeatable epidemiological evidence demonstrating that extreme heat exposure during pregnancy increases the risk of preterm birth, which have significant flow-on health impacts to the child. And it also increases the risk of stillbirth as well. We know that children in hot classrooms struggle to learn. We know that teachers teaching in hot classrooms struggle to teach. And these can have significant downstream health impacts on people's lives, despite this type of heat exposure occurring early in their lifetime. And we know that exertional heat illness is an issue for children participating in sports. Once we reach adulthood, then we know that extreme heat impacts occupational productivity. So in my home country, Australia, there was a study that was published in Nature Climate Change in 2015, which put the number on of extreme heat on productivity of the Australian economy alone at $6 billion a year. If we think about this globally, by the year 2030, it's forecasted that extreme heat is going to cost the global economy more than $2.3 trillion a year in lost productivity. As we get into older age, this is where cardiovascular impacts come into play. We know that primary aging increases the risk of heat-related illness and death owing to age-related reductions in the ability to sweat. So the primary way in which we regulate our body temperature is through sweating. It's the only way in which we can actually physiologically dissipate heat when air temperature exceeds 35 degrees Celsius. That sweat must evaporate in order to provide latent cooling. And if there are impairments in the ability to sweat, that becomes very problematic indeed. The underlying mechanism for that is a lower sensitivity to acetylcholine, which is the neurotransmitter, which is responsible for the pseudomotor response. But what we know, of course, is that primary aging is accompanied by an increased risk of other chronic diseases, not least cardiovascular disease. And if we look at the heat-related mortality statistics, and I'll talk about this a little later on, cardiovascular disease is greatly represented, far more so than classic heat stroke or exertional heat stroke. There are other factors that impact human health and well-being with respect to extreme heat and hot weather across the human lifespan, but I don't have too much time to go into the detail today, but just wanted to mention that they do certainly occur. Now, if we're thinking about the way in which we respond to this threat, we need to think about this in a systems way. So, for example, providing air conditioning to every single person, of course, would be ideal from a protective perspective. But the reality is that it will be impossible to deliver enough electricity to power all those air conditioning units, even if we could get them in the hands of everybody. This is because frail energy infrastructure is existing in a variety of different cities and countries across the world. Even in Sydney, Australia, which is a very developed, of course, urban environment, we're constantly on the brink of a risk of heat-related blackouts, where the demand for energy because of the uptake of air conditioning far exceeds the ability to supply. We also need to be thinking about the way in which extreme heat impacts human health and well-being, particularly from a cardiovascular perspective. When it's provided or occurs in combination with poor air quality. So back in 2019 and 2020, in that summer in Australia, we had the bushfire crisis. And this is where this really came to the fore. And thousands of excess deaths were associated with bushfire, so we'll call high levels of PM2.5. And our understanding is developing that that risk is actually amplified by accompanying heat exposure. So work needs to be done in that particular area. We also know that certain parts of the world are becoming potentially uninhabitable in the future with climate change due to us reaching the physiological tipping point with extreme heat and humidity. The potential impacts of that might result in changes in human migration that could serve as a catalyst for conflict and so forth. We also know that extreme heat aggravates the risk of infectious diseases, and this is some work that we're doing at the University of Sydney. So understanding the way in which extreme heat aggravates the risk of mosquito-borne diseases, most notably malaria, and also increases the risk of waterborne diseases due to contaminated water. So these are the type of things that often are overlooked when we're thinking about the way in which heat stress impacts human health and well-being. It's quite tempting to think it's quite a straightforward and simple problem, but hopefully what's emphasized by this particular slide is very complex, and the level of expertise that we need to engage to develop comprehensive solutions to these complex problems is really quite pressing. So at the Heat and Health Research Centre at the University of Sydney, it was founded in 2022. I'm the founding academic director, and we organise our work according to 5 priority research themes, which are shown here: child and maternal health, physical activity, sport and occupational health, aging and chronic diseases, landscapes in the built environment, and humanitarian settings. And below each of those priority themes, you can see a few dot points of exemplars of projects that are happening within each of those research themes right now. We use this as an opportunity to also provide leadership opportunities to our early and mid-career researchers. So each of these priority research themes are led by an EMCR with oversight from a senior mentor. One thing I should also mention is that we don't really try to silo activities, because of course that is a problem that exists across research and academia in many cases. So we have a lot of cross-cutting activities across these research themes, but we provided these domains in order to try to get ourselves organized in a productive sort of way. So nested within the Heat and Health Research Centre is the laboratory, which I also direct. It's called the Thermal Ergonomics Laboratory. It was originally at Cumberland campus at the University of Sydney when I moved there in 2014, but we relocated to the main campus in Camperdown, and we're now residing on the 9th floor, the top floor of a beautiful new building you can see on the left-hand side. It's called the Susan Wakel Health Building. And so within the laboratory, we have a climate chamber, which was built to specific specifications, which enable us to simulate heat waves of the past, but also we future-proofed it in terms of being able to simulate heat waves of the future. So we work with climate scientists to understand what heat waves of the future look like, create those conditions, those different versions of of future reality based on the decisions that we make with respect to fossil fuel emissions, and then measure what that heat stress actually does to people. And that gives us another opportunity to demonstrate the consequences of our decisions that are made today. So one of the things that we really worked on back in the around about 2015 to 2016 was this notion of simulating heat waves. And we described this in a correspondence that was published back in the Lancet Planetary Health back in very early 2018. And our first study that used this approach was published in 2019 in Annals of Internal Medicine, when we're looking at we were systematically assessing the way in which simple low resource cooling strategies reduce the physiological heat strain that people experience during exposure to these heat extremes. We're very pleased to see that this methodology has been replicated and being used by other research groups around the world in order to try to add additional information to this important topic. So what I'm going to do today is try to address two predominant questions. The first one is really trying to give us a sense of how hot is too hot. And what we'll do today is really focus on people with cardiovascular disease and different complications that are associated with cardiovascular disease from the perspective of extreme heat exposure. We'll touch on medications very briefly. And then I'll finish off by, after describing how terrible everything is try to then talk briefly about the different types of solutions that might be available. And what I want you to do is really think about the settings that a lot of these individuals will find themselves in. We know that biological vulnerability is a very important component of heat-related illness risk, but we also know that the personal setting that people find themselves in, which really compromise their adaptive capacity, is really important to take into account when we're thinking of the type of solutions that need to be provided for those most at risk. So when talking about how hot is too hot, the very first thing I like to do is outline a background framework that we like to use when trying to think through these particular problems. This was illustrated in a really nice figure that was which was developed by my very good colleague, Associate Professor Daniel Gagnon, who's at the University of Montreal, the Montreal Heart Institute. And so Dan led this paper that we published in Physiology this year. It's going to be out in print at the start of next year. And so what this first does, it defines what the hazard is. And so what is really important for many people to understand is that from a perspective of heat stress, we know that the hazard is defined by more than just temperature. If there's one thing that I'd like people to walk away from this talk today, is to understand that temperature is not the only parameter that defines heat stress when it comes to how hot is too hot for people. And also that temperature that we see on the weather forecast, that we see on our phones, that we see on the weather reports, that's actually measured in the shade. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about risk. So we knew that ambient temperature, of course, matters because it defines the temperature difference between the skin and the surrounding environment, which is the drive for convective heat transfer. That could be convective heat gain if the temperature is hotter than you, or heat loss if the air is cooler than at the surface of our skin, which is between 33 and 35 degrees Celsius. But we also know that sweating is a really important physiological mechanism for keeping cool, but it's not the production of sweat that keeps us cool, of course, it's the evaporation of sweat. And the environmental parameter that defines the driving force for that evaporation of sweat is ambient humidity, simply the amount of water vapor, moisture that's in ambient air, which is defined by humidity. So we've got temperature and humidity, and then if you're out of the shade, so in direct solar radiation, and of course, the level of thermal radiation in the environment is very important to characterize. This can be measured with a device called a black globe temperature, which is then uses air velocity and ambient air temperature to define something called mean radiant temperature, which is a fundamental parameter of human heat stress. And finally, airflow. So we'll all be familiar with the sweet relief of a breeze on a hot, muggy day. And this is because air velocity independently modifies heat transfer across the skin surface. It enables, importantly, that sweat to evaporate irrespective of the humidity unless we have completely saturated environment. So we don't have just one environmental parameter that defines human heat stress. We have 4 environmental parameters. So that's what defines the hazard. But then, of course, for a given hazard, it depends what your level of exposure is. This is often defined by your activity, often in an occupational setting, whether you have to be outdoors. Your level of activity is really important because that defines your metabolic heat production, but also the level of clothing that you're wearing, because that serves as a barrier for heat transfer. Most notably, the evaporative heat transfer resistance of clothing determines how well sweat can evaporate through that ensemble. People who live in urban environments are often exposed to higher ambient temperatures owing to something called the urban heat island effect, where architecture and the characteristics of the built environment amplify the levels of heat retention in the environment, which increase ambient temperature. So for a given hazard and a given exposure, we'll get a level of physiological heat strain. Now note that this is not going directly to heat risk. The reason that we illustrate it this way is because the level of heat risk is defined by the level of physiological heat strain. We know that heat stroke is driven by rises in core temperature. We know that the risk of cardiovascular collapse is driven by the level of cardiac strain, which is a direct response to heat exposure. We know that these two factors can be aggravated by dehydration as well as renal strain. So for a given hazard and exposure, we'll get a level of physiological heat strain, and that will then translate into a level of health risk. And note that was not just one type of health risk. There are multiple health risks associated with extreme heat exposure. Now, it will be probably pretty obvious that we have personal characteristics that define, first of all, the level of heat strain that we experience for a given hazard and exposure. But even if we have the same level of heat strain, the susceptibility of an individual to have that then translate into a health risk is also modified by personal characteristics. So when we talk about personal characteristics, we're talking about factors such as primary aging, health status, which obviously then incorporates things like cardiovascular disease, and lifestyle, which also contribute to the risk of cardiovascular disease. So this is the flow-on effect from hazard to exposure to heat strain to health risk, and it's modified by personal characteristics. But the things that we can do about this as well, we can have interventions, which are predominantly through changes in human behavior. This can modify the level of exposure to a given hazard, which then reduces the amount of heat strain, which then reduces the risk of a health impact due to extreme heat. But also behavior can modify the level of heat strain that you get for a given amount of hazard and exposure. So this is obviously a pretty complex framework, but I think it's pretty intuitive when you break it down into those different steps. One thing is probably worth also pointing out that these adaptive behaviors that people engage in, they can both be protective, but they can also be maladaptive as well. And that's probably something else to keep in mind as we're going through this information today. So if we think about cardiovascular disease, I think one of the things that is really important to characterize here is that we know that people with pre-existing cardiovascular disease are at a much greater risk of a negative health outcome related to extreme heat exposure. And this is typically owing to cardiovascular collapse or a primary heart attack. And so this paper that was published in Circulation back in 2022, this was focusing on the level of cardiovascular mortality in the United States between 2008 and 2017. I'm sure many people in the audience will be familiar with this particular study. And the authors of this study reported that roughly 50% of all heat-related deaths in people occur in people with heart disease. So that really demonstrates that people with heart disease are certainly at a much, much greater risk than pretty much everybody else when it comes to extreme heat. And of course, it's not just a cardiovascular disease that's occurring on its own. Often it's coupled with primary aging, and there's complications of things like medications as well. But I think this is a really important paper because it highlights the level of risk that people with cardiovascular disease experience when they're exposed to extreme heat and humidity. Now, the question is why, of course. So first of all, just want to walk you through this particular figure, which we published back in 2021. And it pretty much summarizes, and there have been other studies that have published that have demonstrated or have described this as well, but it pretty much describes the three primary ways in which individuals can succumb to extreme heat exposure. And I'll start off with the obvious one, which is classic heat stroke. This could also be exertional heat stroke, but the underlying mechanism is the same. So we know that one of the primary ways in which we try to defend body temperature is that we redirect blood away from the body core towards the skin surface. And through doing this, this actually reduces the level of blood flow to the endothelial tissues of the gut. And if we reduce the level of heat exposure of blood flow to the gut, this results in a low level of oxygen delivery to the tissues of the gut. And we know from animal studies that when this occurs and it's coupled with high internal tissue temperatures of 40.5 degrees Celsius or higher, we start seeing a loosening of these gap junctions in the gut. So we have an increase in permeability of the gut, which results in a translocation of endotoxins that usually reside inside the gut. There's a translocation from the gut into the bloodstream. So now you end up with endotoxins or bacteria that is now circulating within the bloodstream, and this can set off a cascade of negative effects, which result in mass coagulation around the body, multiple organ failure, and death. So this is a very serious condition indeed, of course. And there are also direct effects of heat on cells as well, which result in cell heat-related cell death as well. So this is classic heat stroke. Exertional heat stroke is the same underlying mechanism, but the causes are slightly different due to the added heat generation inside the body. So you see exertional heat illness typically in younger, fitter people who are physically active, often wearing high levels of clothing due to occupation or being in the military or playing sport. Whereas classic heat stroke is often observed in elderly people and with chronic diseases during heat waves. But one thing that's really important to keep in mind is that the number of heat stroke related deaths during extreme heat events are often in the minority. And in fact, a much greater proportion, as I reported on the previous slide, are associated with cardiovascular disease. Now, it's up until relatively recently, people have drawn a parallel between those two conditions. But what we know more recent work is that, in fact, the underlying mechanism for the increased risk of a heart attack during heat exposure in people with cardiovascular disease is actually different. And it's not necessarily driven by high core temperatures, even though high core temperatures will be a contributing factor. It goes back to that initial response of the body redistribution blood from the body core towards the skin surface. And in order to maintain central blood pressure, we need to increase cardiac output. Now, the cardiac filling pressure is often reduced during heat exposure, particularly if people are upright, because there's a lot of blood sitting in the venous system, in the skin. And therefore, the only way in which we can increase cardiac output is by increasing heart rate. And so now we're asking the heart to contract many more times per minute. If there's an underlying cardiovascular infirmity, such as coronary artery disease, then the requirement of those cardiac myocytes for oxygen to fuel those contractions can't be met by the delivery of oxygen. That can result in local ischemia, which then could potentially then lead to a catastrophic cardiovascular event. So that's the underlying mechanism for a heart attack during extreme heat exposure, not necessarily driven by critical rises in core temperature. And then the other factor that we think of is related to dehydration. So the other way in which we have that vasodilatory response, which is that first primary way in which we try to defend body temperature. The other way is through the production and the evaporation of sweat. So we think about how much sweat we might secrete on a hot day, particularly if we're physically active, then it wouldn't be unusual for us to sweat at least half liter, maybe a liter per hour. And if you think about that volume of water and trying to replenish those lost fluids, it's really quite difficult to drink and your body to absorb that much water. So what we see over prolonged extreme heat exposure in people is this progressive dehydration. So that aggravates the risk of heat stroke. It also aggravates the risk of a cardiovascular event, but it also places extra strain on the kidneys as well, which then leads to an increased risk of people with renal disease as well. So these are the different ways in which extreme heat exposure can mechanistically impact people in different ways. And of course, it's probably evident from this figure is that people with different underlying infirmities will be more susceptible. If we think back to that framework on the previous slide, it's going to be different depending on the avenue of extreme heat exposure. So these are this is a simple trace that I like to show people that demonstrate that really quite dramatic cardiovascular response. This is just a single individual from a study that we conducted back in a couple of years ago. And this was where we were simulating the Melbourne heat wave of 2009, 45 degrees Celsius and 15% relative humidity. And what I'm showing you here is just simply a time-dependent trace of the heart rate response of that individual. Now, if I show this trace to people, often people look at it and think, oh, maybe this person's running on a treadmill or something like this. And in fact, this is just an 84-year-old male with no thermoregulatory impairments, simply seated in a chair. And this is a nice illustration of that dramatic cardiovascular strain that develops during extreme heat exposure. We have that vasodilatory response. Filling pressure is compromised. Therefore, the only way in which cardiac output can be elevated to maintain central blood pressure is through this increase in heart rate. In this particular individual, within just over an hour and a half of exposure, their heart rate reached 86% of their heart rate reserve. And in fact, we had to terminate the trial because it reached the termination criteria for this particular trial. Another thing that's probably important to keep in mind as well is that, again, this is some nice evidence that shows the way in which this cardiovascular strain is not necessarily driven directly by core temperature. These are some data that we published back in 2015, led by Nick Ravanelli. And what we see, so on the left-hand side, we have the core temperature response. This was measured with esophageal temperature. On the right-hand side, we have the heart rate response. And this was something called a humidity ramp protocol. And this was at 42 degrees Celsius. So ambient temperature was maintained the same. And what we do is this progressive stepwise increase in ambient humidity, which challenges the ability of sweat to evaporate. And it then asks the body to then increase sweat production until we get to the point of uncompensability. Now, that's probably not all that important to illustrate what I'm trying to show on this particular slide. Basically, this is two measures of two different outcomes in the same person into the same trial. So we're measuring their core temperature and we're measuring their heart rate. It's 42 degrees Celsius, and we start at 20% relative humidity. And what happens is that as we reach around about 35% relative humidity, we see this linear increase in cardiovascular strain. And the reason I'm showing you this is that what we're observing, and this has been repeatedly demonstrated, is that we see this increase in cardiovascular strain in advance of increases or marked increases in core temperature, demonstrating that, so we see that that core temperature increase actually occurs at a later point when heart rate is already increased by 15 beats per minute in this particular example. So what they're showing is that mechanistically, it's uncoupled. We're seeing this increase in cardiovascular strain, and it's not necessarily driven by the rise in core temperature, meaning that using core temperature as a means of thinking what the risk is for these individuals is maybe not the best way forward for people with cardiovascular disease, for example. Some excellent work that was published by my good colleague Daniel Gagnon, who was at the Montreal Heart Institute, which is a study that was led by his by his PhD student Hadiatu Barry, who's now postdocing with us here in Sydney, which is published in Annals of Internal Medicine last year. And what Dan and Hadiatu's study demonstrated with MRI imaging is showing that people with underlying coronary artery disease, when they're placed in the scanner, they are passively heated with a water-perfused suit. This increasing cardiac work that's required to maintain blood pressure increases the level of blood flow that's required by the cardiac myocytes. And in individuals with coronary artery disease, there's often an increase. I think it was in about a third of participants. It resulted in local ischemia. So this is the first study that's demonstrated local ischemia in the cardiac myocytes in people with coronary artery disease owing due to passive heating alone. So often it's thought about in the terms of people conducting physical activity or exercise. But this study is demonstrating that this local ischemia of the cardiac myocytes can actually occur simply due to heating. And so this is excellent evidence supporting that underlying mechanism of why people with cardiovascular disease have an increased risk of catastrophic cardiovascular events during extreme heat exposure. So some of the questions that we get asked as well are associated with the role of beta blocker medication. And these are some data that we published back in 2024. Again, this is it's a dual site study that we conducted in partnership with Dan's laboratory at the University of Montreal. And so we had we simulated two different types of heat wave exposures, 38 degrees Celsius and 60% humidity, which is a hot, humid heat wave, which was inspired by the conditions that were experienced during the Chicago heat wave of 1995. We also did another condition, which was 45 degrees Celsius and 15% humidity. So a very hot and dry heat wave condition, which is represented by or indicative of the type of experience of conditions in Melbourne, in the Melbourne heat wave in 2009. I'll start off with the Chicago heat wave conditions. So what we're showing here is the rise in rate pressure product, which is the physiological measures that, or physiological indicator or biomarker that we use to indicate the level of cardiovascular strain that is induced during heat exposure. We had a group of older participants who didn't have coronary artery disease, who were 27 individuals. You have another subset of people of 26 participants who had coronary artery disease. And what we see is that the level of of cardiovascular strain that's induced by that passive heat exposure is greater in the individuals without coronary artery disease. However, a complicating factor here is that signal that is associated with the people with coronary artery disease, of course, some of them are taking beta blockers, which would obviously blunt that cardiovascular response to any type of stimulus, not least heat exposure. So if we take that coronary artery disease data, we split them into the individuals who were taking beta blockers and those that were not taking beta blockers. I think it was an N of 18 who had taken beta blockers and an N of 8 or 9 who had not taken beta blockers. And we see that the people that were not taking beta blockers had pretty much the same cardiovascular response to heat stress as the older adults without coronary artery disease. So what this implies is that people taking beta blockers, at least from a cardiovascular perspective, are probably protected somewhat from this cardiovascular strain that's induced by heat exposure. And we saw the same responses replicated in the very hot, dry heat wave exposure. So this wasn't restricted to the hot, humid heat wave exposure, but it also was observed in the other one as well. So the next natural question that somebody might ask themselves is, okay, well, if an individual is taking beta blockers, that's reducing the cardiovascular response to heating, which from a cardiovascular perspective might be protective, but does this impair their ability to dissipate heat? And you wouldn't be blamed for thinking that, of course, because there's been a lot of news articles that have been published in various outlets that often talk about the way in which different types of prescription medications impact people's ability to respond to extreme heat. And some examples that I'm showing here. And if we consult the guidance that's put forth by the World Health Organization, they list a variety of different medication classes and report the different mechanisms that are supposedly associated with taking these different types of medications. And beta blockers are a category that is reported in the WHO guidance. And according to the WHO, taking beta blockers can prevent the dilation of blood vessels to the skin, which makes sense, reducing the capacity to dissipate heat via convection. So this would support this thought process where, okay, people have coronary artery disease, they're taking beta blockers, that's reducing the risk of heat-induced rises in cardiovascular strain, which might then be protected from a cardiovascular perspective, but does it place them at a greater risk of other outcomes such as heat exposure? So we undertook a systematic review and meta-analysis, which was led by my PhD student, Lily Hospers. This was done in collaboration with our colleagues at Penn State University, Larry Kenny and Lacey Alexander. And this was published in 2024. And the goal for Lily's review was to look at the evidence in the literature and systematically assess whether the data support the recommendations put forth by the WHO with respect to the supposed effect of different prescription medications on the risk of hypothermia. So the primary outcome being the core temperature rise during heat exposure. So we have a variety of different figures in the paper. What I'm showing you here is the figure that's associated with the findings with respect to beta blockers. The way that Lily looked at the data is that she separated them between non-selective beta blockers, which you see at the top, and then selective beta blockers that we see at the bottom. And what we observed is that for people based on the data that's available, which is pretty scant to be fair, is people taking non-selective beta blockers. There seems to be an increased risk of hypothermia. It's quite mild, it's quite small, and it's only observed at air temperatures above 30 degrees Celsius. So there's a small risk, according to the scat literature that's available right now. Much of it's very old, of course, suggesting that there might be a slightly greater increase in core temperature if people are taking non-selective beta blockers. But if you look below, we don't see that with selective beta blockers. One thing that's worth pointing out with respect to what the World Health Organization is, that there seems to be some credence to the mechanism that they describe. So if you recall that they say that there's a greater risk of hypothermia in people taking beta blockers because the way in which it alters the ability of blood to get to the skin, which could then impair the ability to dissipate heat via convection. And so that would be observed via a change in skin temperature, so a reduction in skin temperature. And that's exactly what is being seen. So about a 0.5 to 0.7 degrees Celsius lower skin temperature in people taking beta blockers relative to not taking beta blockers, which may then be responsible for the slightly higher rises in core temperature observed in people taking that medication. There was no effect on sweating responses. In terms of the summary of evidence, we saw that across all of the different classifications, just FYI, there seemed to be a heightened hypothermia risk in people taking anticholinergics, only with an anticholinergic burden of 3 only, anti-Parkinson's agents, epinephrine, and then non-selective beta blockers. But there was no current evidence supports the claim of impacts on thermoregulation of other WHO-listed medications. This is not to say that they don't have it, it's just that there's very little evidence supporting it. So clearly a big gap that needs to be filled in the future. So I'll just finish off my presentation by just talking a little bit about the work that we're doing in terms of what people can do to reduce their risk. As I mentioned at the start of the talk, it's important to think about heat stress risk, not just being due to biological factors. So a young adult has a large physiological adaptive capacity and also has high behavioral adaptive capacity. As we progressively age, our physiological adaptive capacity goes down as well as our behavioral adaptive capacity, and that gets further compromised if we have aging with cardiovascular disease. But what we also know is that if an elderly person with cardiovascular disease has access to air conditioning and they can afford to use it, then they're not exposed to the stimulus, and therefore they're not nowhere near as vulnerable. So the type of situations that we want to be looking for solutions for are these individuals that have aging, have cardiovascular disease, but don't have access to air conditioning. So this means that we need to look at solutions that are simple, low cost, and sustainable. So we can think about the way in which we implement different solutions for cooling at 3 different levels of what we call the heat cascade. We can implement interventions at the landscape and urban level, such as thinking about an increase in green infrastructure or blue infrastructure, which reduce the level of ambient heating for a given weather system. We can also introduce interventions at the building level. This is things like changing glazing or changing the insulation of our walls and roofing to ensure that there is a minimal level of transfer of heat from the outdoor environment to the indoor environment to then increase resistance to hot temperatures that way. And then there are things that we can do at the individual level by modifying the different levels of heat transfer, avenues of heat transfer, such as evaporation, convection, and radiation. And ultimately, what really matters, if we think back to that framework that we walked through, we want to think about the way in which different interventions impact thermal strain. Yes, the rise in core temperature, but also the level of dehydration and the cardiovascular strain, which is so important for people with coronary artery disease or other cardiovascular conditions, and also renal strain. So those are the type of biomarkers that we use in these studies when we're trying to understand which type of interventions work or do not work for reducing risk for different individuals in different settings. So the way in which we do this, as I mentioned before, is that we have a laboratory. There are other labs around the world that take a similar approach, where we simulate these different heat extremes from different weather events. We expose human participants to these conditions under careful medical supervision, and we measure biomarkers that are indicative of these different avenues of heat-related morbidity and mortality. We measure core temperature to get a sense of thermal strain. We measure rate pressure product or heart rate to get a sense of cardiovascular strain. We also measure levels of dehydration, such as sweat losses. There are some markers that researchers can use to measure kidney strain as well. So what we're doing is that we're recreating these conditions. We are then systematically assessing the benefit or lack thereof of different low resource cooling strategies, reducing how hot people get, how much work their heart has to do, and how dehydrated they become, and try to use this information to then inform public health guidelines. I had the privilege of co-chairing the first ever Lancet series on heat and health back in 2021, and we had an opportunity to summarize some of the evidence that was available in the literature, which was then delivered in the form of a simple infographic on the left-hand side. And there's been a lot of data that's been published since then, which will be then contributing to an updated version of this in the near future. An example of a study that is complementing these data that was available before is a study that we published back in 2024 and associated with Dan's lab in Montreal, where we, as I mentioned before, we asked participants with coronary artery disease and without coronary artery disease to come in and be exposed to two different types of heat extreme. So there's a hot, humid heat extreme, which was indicative of the Chicago heat wave in 1995, and a very hot and dry heat extreme, which is indicative of the Melbourne heat wave back in 2009, which is 45 degrees Celsius and 15% humidity. So what I would like you to do is just focus on the bottom two panels of this particular figure. What we've got is relative to a control condition where our participants during a 3-hour exposure simply drink cold water, is we ask them to use different types of very low resource cooling strategies. The dotted line indicates the difference between that condition and the control condition where they were simply drinking water. So we tested fan use at the bottom. Skin wetting was where people are not using a fan but applying water to the skin surface. So I try to optimize evaporative heat loss and then combining the two different strategies. So on the bottom left-hand slide figure there, you'll see that in a very hot, in a hot, humid condition, we find that both fan use, skin wetting alone, and fan use with skin wetting, if we consider rate pressure products, so cardiovascular strain has been our primary outcome, which it was for this particular study. All three were beneficial in terms of reducing the level of rate pressure product, which was induced by that heat exposure. On the other hand, when people were exposed to the very hot, dry environment, we found a very different story indeed. Using fans was very detrimental because it tripled the rate of increase in rate pressure product relative to doing nothing at all, which would increase the risk of cardiovascular mortality in people with cardiovascular disease during this type of heat wave if they're using an intervention such as fan use. Skin wetting was beneficial, and then using skin wetting with fan use basically negated the negative effect of fan use but didn't provide any benefit. One thing I'd just like to zero in on the left-hand slide is that what we found is that fan use effect was approximately about 50% of the increase in rate pressure product we saw in the control condition. If we break these data down even more, what I want to do is just quickly look at the difference between people with coronary artery disease and not with coronary artery disease. Now, in the very hot, dry condition, we actually discontinued the study for people with coronary artery disease because we didn't want to expose them to undue level of risk by using a fan. So that's why fan use was not tested in people with coronary artery disease in the very hot, dry condition. So let's focus on the left-hand slide left-hand part of this slide where we're talking about the Chicago heat wave condition. What we find is that people without coronary artery disease seem to have much greater benefit of the fan use. So if you look in the top left slide here, relative to people with coronary artery disease. But as I described before, is if we break down these individuals with coronary artery disease into people who are taking beta blockers and not taking beta blockers, what we find is a very protective effect of these different interventions in people who have coronary artery disease but are not taking beta blocker medication. So arguably those who are greatest at risk. And if you want a bit of context of this, these reductions are around about 85 to 90% of the heat-related increase in cardiovascular strain that these individuals were experiencing if they didn't use an intervention alone. So we're pretty much eliminating that heat-related rise in cardiovascular strain in people who have coronary artery disease but are not taking beta blocker medications with these simple low-resource cooling strategy interventions. One other thing that's quickly worth pointing out is that in the very hot, dry condition, where these are in the older adults that didn't have coronary artery disease, we had 6 individuals that had to pull out before the trial was complete. And this was indicative of the very negative effect of fan use in these very hot, dry conditions. So you can imagine what the impact might be if people with coronary artery disease, particularly if they weren't taking beta blocker medications, were using fans in very hot, dry conditions. This is why we recommend that these interventions are not used in these very hot conditions. So collecting these data, publishing these studies in very nice journals is also obviously always a thrill, but it's not all the job. The key is really to try to translate this information and the information that is collected by our colleagues around the world into changes in public health policy and practice. So to that end, we partner with the World Health Organization, and we also domestically partner with a lot of public health organizations at the state level in Australia, such as the New South Wales Health Branch, the Victorian State Department of Health, and the Queensland Government Department of Health. We also partner with the Royal Australian College of GPs and other NGOs to translate our findings into changes in public health practice. We've also developed a new tool, which is our Heat Watch tool, which is available using this QR code. It's a web tool right now, but you can load it as a native app. And this enables individuals to create personal profiles, so you can create a profile telling it how old you are, and whether you're on certain types of medication, whether you have a certain chronic disease, whether you have access to air conditioning. And we use this to develop a personal heat plan for an individual to let them respond to their own individual heat stress risk. We also use this as a platform to deliver this evidence-based advice to the people who need it when they need it. This is still a prototype tool, and we're acquiring funding at the moment to expand the use of this tool in a range of different target populations. I'll finish off, I'm running out of time, but I'll finish off with a very simple intervention that we're really recommending that people use, which is something called a fan-first cooling strategy. So if people have air conditioning, what we encourage them to do is actually to use a fan first and set their thermostat to a higher temperature before it starts working. We know that thermal discomfort is driven by a temperature threshold, which typically around about 22 degrees Celsius, which is the temperature which people set their thermostat to turn their AC on to start cooling. This requires a lot of energy to keep the home cool throughout a hot day. But what we know is that if you start moving air first, this cools the body without cooling the air, and it increases the temperature at which people feel uncomfortably hot. So what we ask people to do is then to adjust their set point of their air conditioner to turn on at a higher temperature, say 27 degrees Celsius. They feel just as cool, but the air conditioner is turning on later in the day, it's turning off earlier in the day, and it's not working as hard throughout the day. And that results in a much greater reduction in the amount of energy that's required to keep people cool during hot temperatures. And what we found is that when we translate this into changes in greenhouse gas emissions, this results in about a 70 to 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from AC use if people just use this fan-first cooling strategy. To put this into perspective, this is something called a greenhouse gas abatement cost analysis. It's basically, very simply put, it's the benefit of reductions in greenhouse gas emissions relative to the cost of implementing an intervention. The best thing that we've been able to do to date, which is the transition of lighting from incandescent lighting to LED lighting. Everybody did this about 15 years ago because it was good for the environment. And we estimate that this fan-first cooling strategy is actually superior to that from the perspective of a cost-benefit analysis. I'll finish off there. Thank you very much for your attention. If you're interested in the work that we do a very short documentary with the BBC back in 2023, which highlights a bit of the work that we're doing in the Heat and Health Research Centre, and you can scan that QR code and take a look at that film for free at that link. But I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Well, first and foremost, I want to say what a masterful presentation, walking us through epidemiology to physiological underpinnings to policy to practical solutions and suggestions. Really enjoyed the presentation. And what I may not have mentioned earlier on is in those nearly 200 registrations, we have members from the public attending today. And so I'm sure many of them are sitting here listening, as well as our scientists and our trainees and other government members who are joining in terms of what policies they may be able to enact, today within their own households. I'm also reminded that the last CACPR guidelines, our Canadian Association of Prevention and Rehabilitation, our last guidelines were 2009. And while we are working to advance those guidelines or update them, this is a really important topic that should be included in our next edition for our Canadian guidelines, as it would be for any national guidelines. Okay, so I'm now going to, we've got a few minutes left here. I want to open the floor to questions and those online. So I'll just set up here. Okay, anyone in person first, or should I? Oh, no, go ahead, Dr. Mullen. Thank you very much. Power it up. Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thanks very much for the great presentation. So one question around inflammation and in your in your chambers, are you measuring inflammatory markers? And then, excuse me, I'm thinking about people with, especially sort of our rheumatologic autoimmune diseases and, are you studying that population? That's my first question.
Yeah, thank you. No, we're not. And so yeah, obviously we'd like to answer all questions at once with one study, but obviously this is not possible. So yeah, the studies that we've done to date have focused on young people, older adults, and people with coronary artery disease or heart disease. So to that end, the biomarkers that were selected for those studies have been really directed at the primary risks associated with those conditions. But of course, there are a lot of other groups of individuals with different disorders that would require a different biomarker to understand the role of heat, but also then the role of interventions at reducing that risk. And it's certainly a worthwhile area investigating. There is some work that's been done in the Northern Territory in Australia that's led by an excellent researcher called Simon Quilty. And so he's interested in looking at the much greater risk of rheumatic heart disease in First Nations individuals in the Northern Territories. And that seems to be driven by the living conditions. So it's very hot in the Northern Territories. And so often in those conditions, there is a single room that might be cooler than the other conditions, and therefore often overcrowded conditions as well. So what they're finding is that they're having a lot of people that are congregating in a single room because of the slightly cooler environment there relative to other parts of the house. Then that's serving as a bit of a catalyst for the increased risk of rheumatic heart disease. So what Simon's doing is trying to look at interventions at the building level to try to see if that will then decrease the risk of that particular outcome.
Thank you. Do I have time for one more practical question? No.
Maybe. I would love to ask that.
Okay, you're next. Super practical. So when we're skin wetting, should we be using body temperature water or cold water?
Right, great question. So actually, it really doesn't matter that much. The greatest heat transfer benefit that we get is from the vaporization of that water. So as it evaporates from the skin. So it basically does the same thing as sweating does, but without having to sweat. Obviously sweat is not cold when it comes out. It's pretty much body temperature, and it works pretty well. Applying water to the skin surface, no matter what the temperature is. If it's cooler, then you probably will also stimulate thermosensors, which predominantly reside in the skin. And so you'll get a cooler sensation from cold water. But in terms of the heat transfer that you get, you might get a little bit more with cold water, but predominantly what really matters is that it evaporates. So just getting water on the skin and enabling it to evaporate is the main thing.
We're getting a flood of questions here, so we'll see what we can do in 1 minute or 2 minutes.
I'm happy to answer any offline as well. If you want to follow up with an email or something, I can answer.
Always a good sign of a presentation. Okay, so first up are people with non-CAD types of cardiovascular disease, such as arrhythmias, structural heart disease. Are they less or different from the less different risk from heat events?
Well, so the driver is still the driver is vasodilatory response. So we see that pretty much intact in most individuals, depending on the medication status. So if we think through that mechanism, then the vasodilatory response, you need the increase in cardiac output. If you have that increase in cardiac output, is driven by predominantly the increased heart rate response, and so that's going to place other people with other cardiovascular diseases at a greater risk of a negative event as well, because that extra cardiac work that is required in order to maintain blood pressure. So anything associated with that will be at a greater risk.
Okay, I'm going to squeeze in one last question for you today. Thank you. Many of our patients have heart failure, and accurate fluid management is critical. What would you recommend regarding fluid and electrolyte management in heat settings for our patients with underlying heart failure?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. So, and this is something that we're really interested in at the University of Sydney. So, what we hear anecdotally from physicians is that often people who are taking diuretics because to avoid preload for heart failure will often be hospitalized during hot weather because of an increased risk of syncope or often falls. And this often happens in an outdoor environment. They might be doing some guarding. They stand up really quickly, and they can't maintain their blood pressure, and then they pass out, and then they might then have an injury from a fall. And so this is, of course, because that sweet spot for maintaining hydration is much narrower for people on those types of medications. That disorder than or a condition than a healthy person. So the issue is that we're taking diuretics to avoid preload on the heart. The thing is, then we're sweating, and therefore we're depleting the body of fluid. And therefore, what we need to do is have a much better way of estimating how much extra water people need to drink in order to maintain that accurate level of body water. And so we've developed some sweat rate calculators for young, healthy people. And so the next step is actually to then start developing that approach, but in people with heart failure, and trying to get a sense if we can accurately predict what those fluid requirements are. Another thing is also trying to have interventions that then prevent people with heart failure from having to sweat too much. So skin wetting would obviously be an obvious one, because then you get the evaporative heat loss, then you don't have to sweat, and therefore you don't have the risk of that issue. You still will have the vasodilatory response though, which will then further challenge blood pressure.
Well, I want to, on behalf of everyone in person here and online today, I want to give a huge thank you to making some time in your schedule to present at cardiac rehab rounds at the University of Ottawa Heart Institute. It was a pleasure to spend some time with you this afternoon. I wish you all the best in your travels home, and thank you again for such a wonderful and enlightening presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
And we'll now go enjoy our winter.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye. Bye. London. Yeah. Wow. He just landed. I don't want to touch Rebecca's laptop. He was going to have to get up at like 3 in the morning to do the presentation.